I'm Katie Bennett-Stenton, a senior B2B marketing professional with a real interest in digital transformation, change management and developing amazing content. I live in Melbourne, Australia with my husband and two mostly delightful children. Having worked in marketing roles in the UK, US and Australia, I've met many inspiring people and benefited enormously from the power of network and community. In this Katie Talks podcast series, I uncover the stories of influencers, sharing their thought-provoking business and leadership insights. My guest today is Richard Yetsenga, Chief Economist and Head of Research at ANZ, a role that he's held since 2016. Richard's writing reflects his interest in the interconnected nature of the world across business, economics, technology and society. Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Katie.
Really interested to be having this conversation with you today.
I've been looking forward to it.
Me too. As we sit here, Richard, we had prepared some questions a couple of weeks ago, which I was very much looking forward to. And as we record today, I can't very well sit here and not ask you about how COVID-19 is impacting your day job and your life. Keen to understand a little bit more about that before we get into some questions.
That was then, this is now, I suppose. Unfortunately, it's changed almost everything. This is a big issue. It's a global issue. It's something we don't understand a lot about. One of the really interesting aspects of this great job I have is, we're forced to focus on things at different times that we're not actually experts in and we don't have a lot of history in. So we research really hard and do the best we can. COVID-19 has introduced a huge amount of uncertainty, not just into the way we think about Australia, but China and the world. And I think this uncertainty is going to be with us for quite a few months yet, unfortunately.
It's interesting to see how, interesting perhaps not in a great way, to see how rapidly this is evolving. I mean, initially or a week ago, we were even talking about if it reaches Australia in significant numbers. Now, last night the Victorian Premier talking about it being a matter of time before Victorian schools are shut.
Us humans, one of the things we don't do well is we don't do exponential growth very well. Not surprising, exponential growth is hard to do in your head. But viruses follow an exponential growth pattern. So it's today, I think it's in 108 countries or thereabouts. 6 weeks ago, it was probably in 8. And unfortunately, when a country starts to test and identify this virus, the number of cases can double or triple or increase by 50% on a daily basis for a period. And that's quite shocking to us. And the system starts to respond to that. I mean, if there's a particularly unfortunate aspect to this is individual countries don't seem to learn enough from the countries that have gone before them with this virus. It seems to have to hit home in terms of the domestic spread before countries start to say, well, I need to respond. When actually we've had lots of overseas experience now that this seems pretty virulent. It will spread. We need to be prepared for that.
Well, and I've heard some interesting commentary around the fact that numbers are receding in China, and that in view, with the benefit of a little bit of time, that it's looking like perhaps the response was pretty decent.
So the Chinese response, in inverted commas, obviously the ideal response is we can inoculate against the virus. That does seem like it's some time away. So the only alternative response is aggressively tracking the cases and restricting human-to-human contact and movement. And of course, economically, that is extremely damaging. That's a very severe recession in the areas affected because you're effectively shutting down domestic demand down to the very bare necessities and restricting movement. The good news is China looks to be containing the virus. The number of new cases is still growing on a daily basis, but it's growing less quickly.
Sure.
So we still want to see the number of cases falling, but certainly, the trend lines are pointing in the right direction.
And Richard, I'm interested to understand, as we're talking about the increasing likelihood that people will need to self-quarantine and spend time working at home or at home for a period of time, how how does society go about getting cash into the pockets of workers and companies so that they can keep the economy alive while they bunker down?
Look, as we record this, we're waiting today or yesterday or tomorrow the Treasurer to announce some sort of fiscal package to respond to this, and you know, people will look at two things. One is just the size of the package and what signal that's sending about the government's focus on this, and the second issue is the detail of the package and the way they think they can transmit their intended fiscal stimulus actually into people's incomes and into businesses' incomes. And I think you raise a really pertinent point. You know, as uncertain as this looks, and it doesn't look great, ultimately this should be a temporary shock of some finite nature. So the stimulus does really need to get into people's pockets very, very quickly.
Sure. Any thoughts on what that might look like?
Look, I would expect them to have a big focus on businesses retaining workers, a big focus on where people unfortunately do end up losing their jobs. It would make sense that any waiting periods for unemployment benefits, for instance, are waived or minimised. You could potentially look at how to deal with the casualisation of the workforce, where if you can encourage businesses to retain their casual labour, the government may step in and help with some share of the wage bill, because of course casual workers don't get sick leave and other things. One of the fortunate positions Australia has itself in is, of course, the health system is very accessible to virtually the entire population.
Which can't be said for the rest of the world.
There are other countries, you know, either that have insufficient health care, or even countries like the US that have sufficient health care, but it's not accessible unless you have the right credit card.
Yeah, absolutely. So Richard, it's been a pretty tumultuous start to 2020.
It has been amazingly tumultuous, actually.
Yeah. The bushfires, we wrote this question 2 weeks ago. And, you know, as we work to keep abreast of how things are evolving, it often brings to stark attention differing views. The bushfires and COVID-19 have made us refocus on differing views around climate. How does that impact your work?
It has in fact resulted in what looks to be a big shift in views about climate, but it is also back to the future. Surveys were saying 10 or 12 years ago in Australia that climate was a big issue. If you remember then, Australia had gone through some pretty poor climatic conditions. There was quite an extended drought in the rural sector. It seems like as climatic conditions improve, then focus on climate tends to diminish, and of course it's come back again. I think climate is like some other, I suppose, secular issues like technology. I think it's not just an issue for businesses and the economy, but for individuals as well. So how do I evolve myself as an employee to ensure I can use technology the best and it's not going to take over my job? How do I run my business in a way that takes advantage of technology and ensures I don't get squeezed from it? How do I manage the economy to benefit from technology? You could replace technology in all those sentences with climate, basically. What's my role in climate change mitigation as an individual? What's my firm's role in managing its climate responsibilities as well as its purpose to the employees and the owners of the company? And how do we manage the economy in a world where the market price for resources doesn't reflect all the costs of those resources, like the climactic costs?
Well, and that leads us back to COVID-19, or can, in terms of Chinese factories shutting down or being, operating at reduced capacity and having less need for Australia's resources. That seems a bit of a circular discussion.
Look, it is a little bit. I think one of the I work with a fantastic team. One of the benefits that gives me is when we enter these periods, certainly I'm focused on what it means right now, but I'm also starting to think about, when we come out of it, what will have changed.
Okay.
And I think COVID-19 just, again, like some other issues we've had in recent years, like the trade wars, exposes how interconnected the world is, how hyper-connected the world is, and how much we rely on global supply chains. And this is not just a China issue. China's a big part of it, but it's an everything issue. it's not clear that the hyper nature of that interconnected world suits the world we have today. And not necessarily because we should expect pandemics all the time, but because countries don't get on the way they used to. Even during this period, the World Health Organization, when they announced there was a health issue of global concern, said travel restrictions are not necessary or advisable. The next day, the US announced travel restrictions. Other countries followed. The IMF has said for us to get through this in the best shape, we need strong global coordination, and yet global coordination is largely absent, actually. So the way now global supply chains have been structured, which reflect, I think, the way the world used to be, will increasingly need to be redesigned by businesses and governments.
Interesting. And you say that you're starting to give some thought to what the world looks like after, which is a nice positive thing to hear, rather than just focusing on the issues where we are at the moment. What are your embryonic thoughts as to?
Yeah, I mean, a few rough ideas. There are. I'm an economist, so my brain starts with the economics. Interest rates will obviously be a lot lower, and for those economies that weren't at or close to zero, they look like they're going to be at or close to zero. Genuine shocks to domestic demand often are very fiscally damaging. They deteriorate the fiscal position often surprisingly sharply and by surprisingly large amounts. So I think, to the extent we've always looked at Japan as having a kind of the worst fiscal position, I think more countries will look like Japan, maybe not as severe, but certainly fiscal positions will be more significant. But there are other things, back to the supply chain issue, and if we focus on a couple of recent examples, Germany announced they were restricting exports of medical supplies. India announced it was prioritising the domestic market when it came to antibiotics and some other drugs. A globalised network works when everything's working seamlessly. But again, this is not about expecting another pandemic, but clearly we're in a world which is more unsettled from a geopolitical perspective. I would expect governments to have more focus and more awareness of strategically important or strategically sensitive parts of the economy, like your medical supply chain.
Yeah.
And what does that look like, and how are we exposed to something going wrong either in one of our major trading partners or somebody deliberately interfering with that supply chain?
There's so much to ask about that. But
a lot of it's a bit sobering, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
It is. Well, you know what? I'm going to change tact entirely, Richard. Right before Christmas, I saw your summer holiday reading and listening list, and I know that you read prolifically. What does a typical week look like for you on that front?
Look, I do try and read a lot. I think we all have particular perspectives on even our own discipline in the world, and I think trying to test ourselves and add to that knowledge, I think is really, really important, and it keeps us growing. And the way we've always stayed ahead of the machines is to keep growing as individuals. And obviously we're needing to run faster than ever before to do that. So I have a bit of a routine during the day in terms of the news and things I really want to get across. And I'm pretty obsessive about my email. I suffer a lot of personal anxiety if my email is not under control. So my aim always is to get my unread emails to fit onto one screen on my computer.
Computer rather than your device?
Oh, that's impossible, device.
Okay.
But if it's on one screen on my computer, then at least, I feel the sense of that's my Zen space. And then on the weekends, and particularly on holidays, I do try and pick up a really interesting novel, or if I'm reading about the environment or technology or diversity, which is something I've tried to learn a lot about and step out of my man sphere, and really think about things from other people's perspective. Then I try and do that on the weekend as well, to try and keep a strategic focus to my role. It's easy to get caught up on today and tomorrow and next week.
Sure.
But again, often these underlying trends, which are slower moving, actually end up being really, really powerful, and they end up affecting all the short-term stuff. And if you just focus on that, I think you miss some of those important shifts.
Sure. So you've said reading is the mechanism that works well for you. What are your go-to publications?
So I'm a religious kind of FT scanner. I mean, reader is a strong term, but I certainly scan all the emails they send me to pick out things that are interesting. I'm a religious kind of saver. I still, unfortunately, one of the areas I fall down on for the environment is I still print quite a bit of stuff out because I find it's the best way I can keep track of it. I have my morning coffee over the Australian Financial Review typically, and if I'm overseas, it'll be over the Financial Times. There's something tactile about reading the stinky newsprint and getting black fingers.
I agree.
And then I try really hard to make sure I look at every piece that ANZ Research publishes, and that might sound like a simple thing to do. We do about 8 pieces a day, so for me to kind of get across all of those, I think is really, really important. But also that's a pretty serious time commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you step away from more reading on the weekend, or?
No, I tend to read longer term stuff. I mean, I always have a pack of reading I carry around with me, which might be longer term articles. At the moment it might be something I've never read about before, the economic impacts of pandemics.
Sure.
I never thought I needed that in my skill set.
It's a shame, isn't it?
Exactly. I'm trying to read a bit about that. I've got a particularly interesting piece on climate change which talks about policies which try and trigger tipping points.
Okay.
And we know in human behaviour that tipping points are particularly important. Thank you, Malcolm Gladwell. Thinking about that, and often on an issue like climate change, what I'll try and do is take an issue which is tangential to economics and really weave the economics into it. So what can my economic lens say about that issue, not just from an economy perspective, but maybe even from a social or a business perspective?
Okay. I'm interested to understand a little more about that. I read a great interview with Madeleine Albright recently where she talked about the importance of having the self-discipline to look at issues from a different perspective and to actively address and fight confirmation bias. How do you do that?
I agree. I think that is really important, and Madeleine's advice there, I think, is really, really solid. Another piece of, it wasn't direct advice, but something else which really strikes me from another female global leader is Christine Lagarde interviewed in the Weekend Financial Times in their, they take someone to lunch kind of section.
Yes, yeah.
You should do lunch, Katie, next time. But,
okay.
She declined the wine at lunch, and the journalist asked her why, and she said, because I decided years ago I couldn't meet the priorities that I thought were important as well as consume alcohol in my life. And that really struck me as we can't do everything, right?
Yes.
You can't have this rocket ship career, be a fantastic parent, maintain your spousal relationships, maintain your relationships with your extended family and relatives, maybe have some social media connections, have some time to yourself, exercise.
Rest, sleep.
That too, if you've got time. So you do need to prioritise a bit, and that's always really stuck with me that to some extent, the way the world is now, it's a almost infinite possibility and things to do. One of the things is exercising control about what we don't do. One of the things I really try and do is read stuff that I think sounds a bit silly.
Okay. Well, one article that you were talking to me about that I love the sound of, and a really good example of you reading widely, is an article that you mention which examines the way that song lyrics have evolved since the 90s. Talk me through that, and perhaps how that might influence your profession.
That's a good question. I haven't really got to phase B yet, how I'm going to weave it into a talk or a speech or a piece of research, but it's a use of data which obviously as an economist I quite like. We quite like data.
Yes.
It's a use of technology because they've run the top 100 global songs for the past couple of decades through some algorithms. So that was an interesting aspect of it, and it's also obviously a comment about society because presumably the songs we write and the songs that are popular reflect something about us and the way we're going. And it's not Alanis's fault. I kind of blame Alanis Morissette with Jagged Little Pill because for some reason that sticks in my head. It is a classic. But look, if you were looking for a Zen moment, it's not what you'd put on. For some reason, it really sticks in my head as just this this impactful song from a young woman back in 1995, believe it or not. That was around the time that the use of the word hate in songs started to increase quite sharply, and the use of the word love in songs started to decrease quite sharply. It's clearly not Alanis.
We won't blame Alana.
But again, a tipping point. For me, that was a bit of a tipping point. Economists often focus on GDP, and we forget GDP is the means to an end. The end is higher standards of living. GDP has been the means. I think it's as the rate of GDP growth that we can generate out of the economy diminishes, and I do think it's diminishing structurally, it diverges more intently from that quality of life, which is the ultimate goal. And unfortunately, I think too many people are still focused on we've just got to grow GDP. Well, no, actually what we need to do is improve living standards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And hopefully get happier songs.
Absolutely. As an interesting aside, I understand that there's an Alanis Morissette Jagged Little Pill show on Broadway at the moment.
Right.
So
well, I'm not travelling internationally at the moment.
Well,
so
I'm supposed to be going to watch my dad run the Boston Marathon next month, and we'll
see.
We'll see. Watch that space. Yeah, I'm not sure that's going to happen. Richard, you mentioned having a bit of a presence on social media earlier, and you're quite active on Twitter. I'm interested to understand how that influences the way that you communicate.
Yeah, the Twitter was a real out of my comfort zone thing for me. That's not the way I would normally communicate. I probably am a bit more of trying to be the sage, considered economist than the pithy Twitter person. It was kind of made clear to me an important part of my role was my external profile. Mm-hmm. So, you will twit was kind of the subliminal order, and I found some people in the team that were good at that. Generally, they happen to be women, actually, which I think is one of the benefits of working with a diverse group of people. And they really helped me just think about Twitter and what can you put there that is going to interest people and promote your brand in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people have brands on Twitter. You might not want their brand.
No.
So I think probably over time I've got a bit more used to trying to marry Twitter with my existing thought processes and work. And when I find something interesting, like the piece about songs, I'll come up with a little tweet and tweet it, and that also is part of my checklist for I can then go back and look at my posted tweets when I'm looking for little interesting tidbits that I might have lost along the way. So it's kind of a bit of a mental record for me as well. So I'm kind of using it as a filing system in a sense.
I like to do the same thing, interspersed with a few personal bits and pieces, but I also think that's quite an interesting approach.
Yeah, I'm pretty narrow on the personal stuff, I have to be honest. I find that a bit complicated.
Each to their own. Yeah.
Although I did put something up the other day, how hard is it not to shake hands? And that people seem to relate to that. And
I saw that one.
As we sit here today, I continue to find it difficult to do the jazz hands
thing. I know.
Yeah, thank you for the jazz hands tip as well. So.
Anytime, Richard. My pleasure. I'm interested to understand how Twitter has influenced the way that you consume media, how you ensure that sources are reliable.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do worry about that a lot. The thing about Twitter, I think, is it's easy to... And again, we're all busy and we're trying to prioritise the right things. It's easy just to read something and kind of factual when we know that's not the case. And I think this is where on Twitter some time... and not the time you apply, but just over time, working out who really has some valid views and who has foundation to their views. Yes. And just because they've got 20,000 followers, it doesn't mean they're fantastic.
No.
They may just specialise in anti-Trump stuff, and that may or may not be helpful.
Few of them out there.
Right, that may or may not be helpful at different times. But so there's a few people, particularly around China, that I've followed that I knew when I worked in Hong Kong. And that's obviously, they really have been useful during this period.
Sure.
And I have found Twitter the most useful source of information about what's happening because it's the on-the-ground stuff that's been really important. So early in the China piece, people talking about exactly how the healthcare system was responding, and like other countries, not particularly well, to be fair, at the beginning. Sure. A photo of Shanghai train station.
Empty.
Completely empty. I mean, that is just a powerful signal about the economic shock that was going through the Chinese economy. And then, people that summarise information. So, the World Health Organization might issue something which is very long and technical and medical related, and somebody who I follow may have a way interpret that, for me, and I found that really useful as well.
I think your last point is really interesting, and as a marketer, it's that ability to think about how people consume content, and frankly, the days of the 50-60 page doorstopper report, not for time poor people the optimal way to go. It is the much shorter and concise content that's easy to consume.
Well, I mean, one of the things that's been good for me, actually, one of the things in this role I've tried to do is write research for everybody who might have an interest rather than people who are necessarily experts. And I think, bank research often might be very targeted towards people who live and breathe the economics, like investment managers and other specialists, and trying to be broader around that. And I think that really has helped because, for instance, I try and publish half a dozen op-eds in the paper a year in different ways. 750 words is all you got, baby. So you better get the ideas into there and get them out. And so there's no weeds. You got to get the story across.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Richard, what might people not know about you?
Look, they'd know I love economics. They probably would know nothing else, to be fair. I don't tend to talk about me very much. I don't think. I come from a house full of females. I've got my wife and I've been married for 25 years next month, actually. I've got 2 daughters, both. The second one started at university, so the house is a bit emptier. Holly is our lovely Labradoodle who's 11 years old, who unfortunately is on the downhill side of the Big Dipper. Yeah, it's a bit sad. But we did get Jessie recently, who's the male addition to the house. I think we have a bit of regret bias about getting a male dog, but but he keeps, gets Holly out of a bed more than she probably would want to. Yeah.
What breed is he?
He's a Labradoodle as well. Yeah, we like the hypoallergenic, don't drop hair everywhere kind of dog.
Yeah, I'm with you. Oh. You might have to tweet us a photo of him.
Maybe.
Pushing you out of
And I love the water. Swimming, surfing, being on a boat. I'm kind of Aquaman.
Sydney's a bit good for that.
Sydney's pretty good for that. Yep.
Absolutely. Richard, an interesting question to close with. What does nirvana look like in your career?
This might sound like a trite response. I think I'm there, actually. I think I've got the best job in the bank. That's just my selfish kind of view. I work with a fantastic team of people who, we test each other. We work under enormous pressure sometimes, and yet there's a lot of respect. And I think the way we treat each other as human beings, never ceases to amaze me. And I work for a fantastic forward-looking institution. It's no secret that financial sectors globally are going through some complicated times, but I think in terms of the response to those conditions, the focus on the quality of employees, really thinking about how to do things differently and being thoughtful about how we go about our work and being, really values-based. Again, it's a bit like the Economist thing, the difference between GDP and growing living standards. Really focusing on the quality of what we're doing and the human side. I feel really fortunate to have the role I have in ANZ.
Nice answer.
Unscripted.
Totally unscripted, but from the heart and authentic. I like it. Richard, thanks so much for your time today, particularly with all that you have going on at the moment. It's been really interesting.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Katie.
Thank you. And thanks for listening to the Katie Talks podcast with me, Katie Bennett-Stenton. If you enjoyed this episode, it'd be great if you could take a few seconds to share it and review me on iTunes to help others find this great content.